She just wanted a chance. A job to help her younger sister pay the overdue rent and start over after a series of setbacks. Daniel, on the other hand, wanted revenge. He believed Ella's father had destroyed his family's business years ago. When he saw her name among the candidates for a position in his company, he had an idea: hire her to get even, with coldness and manipulation. But the more he got to know Ella, the more his plans unraveled. She was nothing like he expected, and what started as a game turned into a dilemma: hold on to his revenge or save his own heart. Ella Carter was tired of empty promises. Stacks of resumes handed out, interviews where no one even looked her in the eye, and bills piling up one after another weighed constantly on her chest. But she couldn't stop. Not with her little sister, Lily, waiting at home with open notebooks and hopes for a better life. That morning, her hair hastily tied back and the same worn-out blazer as always, Ella walked into Hunt Corporation with one goal: get that job. She didn't need much, just a chance. The building was made of mirrored glass, reflecting the city Ella only knew from the outside. For the first time, she stepped through the revolving door of a place where heels echoed on polished floors and people carried shiny briefcases. Impeccable receptionists, digital screens, the smell of expensive coffee. Ella's heart beat faster, not from fear, but as a reminder: you belong wherever you set foot. She repeated it to herself before offering a firm smile and saying her name to the receptionist. Interview for project assistant. Ella Carter. Upstairs, Daniel Hunt watched everything through a discreet camera. He had access to every floor, every department, including the waiting room where the candidates sat. When he saw her name on the shortlist, he couldn't believe it. Ella Carter, daughter of Robert Carter, the man he believed ruined his father's legacy. For years, he held on to that pain like a debt yet to be paid. And now, fate had delivered that man's daughter into his company, asking for a chance. Daniel didn't believe in coincidences. He believed in opportunities. The interview went like all the others, but something about Ella stood out. She spoke with confidence, without arrogance. Admitted she didn't meet all the listed qualifications, but showed real, hands-on experience. I learned quickly. I'm loyal. And I care. Those were the words that echoed in Daniel's mind. As he sat at his desk, flipping through her resume and already crafting a different plan. He didn't just want to test her. He wanted to expose her, humiliate her, prove that no one from the Carter family deserved trust. It was irrational, but his rage ran deeper than logic. The next day, Ella got the call. She was hired. Inside, she screamed with joy. On the outside, she thanked them with the serenity of someone who's had everything taken before. Her first morning began early, like always. She arrived before time, studied the new space, organized her materials, and made herself a simple cup of coffee. She didn't know she was being watched. Daniel passed by her in silence, never introducing himself, just observing, calculating, waiting for the first mistake. But Ella didn't slip. Not once. Not even a complaint. Over time, she started noticing strange looks from colleagues. It was as if she had invaded a space that didn't belong to her. Some whispered. Others tried to test her patience with contradicting orders. But Ella took a breath and carried on. When asked if she needed help, she smiled. When someone left a deliberately incomplete report, she redid it. She didn't demand respect. She earned it. And that started to make people uncomfortable. Daniel, meanwhile, was growing frustrated with something he couldn't explain. There was no real reason to hate her. Ella didn't match the image he had painted. Nothing in her reminded him of the man who caused his pain. Still, he clung to the narrative he had built over years. She must be pretending, just like her father. So he acted. He gave her a near impossible task, tight deadline, vague instructions. He wanted to see her fail. But again, that didn't happen. Ella stayed up all night, typing, researching, organizing. Not out of fear of losing the job, but out of pride. She wouldn't quit. When she handed in the project the next morning, eyes tired but smile steady, Daniel looked directly at her for the first time. And something in him faltered. "Thank you for the opportunity," she said, as if she didn't know she was part of a cruel game. Or maybe she knew and chose not to play it. That night, Daniel stayed late at the office. Alone, he reviewed her report. It was flawless, better than most senior executives delivered. He dropped the pages on his desk, rubbed his face, and sat in silence. For the first time in years, he wasn't sure he was on the right path. His revenge now felt small, and Ella's presence grew in his mind as something he could no longer ignore. Meanwhile, across the city, Ella returned home. She caught the bus, stopped at the store, bought milk, and climbed 3 flights of stairs with groceries in hand. Lily was waiting with a drawing in her hands. "To my sister, the best in the world." Ella smiled. She sat on the couch and exhaled. As hard as the day had been, she knew this was a fresh start. What she didn't know was that her fresh start was part of a much bigger plan, one that wasn't hers. Not yet.in the following days, Daniel kept testing her. He called unnecessary meetings, demanded edits to already approved reports, issued contradicting instructions. But with each new challenge, Ella met him with calm. She never lashed out, never played the victim, and that only confused him more. He wanted her to snap, to yell, to break, but instead she endured, and that disarmed him more than any argument. Could point one afternoon, after another exhausting meeting, Daniel watched her leave the room, arms full of folders, expression tired but dignified, and in turn beside him whispered, "She's kind of strange, huh? Always so calm." Without thinking, Daniel replied, "Or maybe she's just better than most people here." As the words left his mouth, he froze. Something inside him was shifting, but he still wasn't ready to admit it. Ella, on the other hand, was beginning to wonder why the saying seemed to have a personal issue with her. He was never rude, but always distant, cold, provocative. She tried to ignore it, focus on the work, but that silent tension bothered her. It felt like she was being tested, but why? And by whom? One night, while sorting through old files, Ella came across a familiar name, Robert Carter. Her father, an old contract, a business dispute, a closed case. Her stomach turned. She didn't want to remember that time, the abandonment, the shame. But now, everything made sense. The CEO was Daniel Hunt, and she was the daughter of the man who, according to the media, had destroyed his family's business. Ella understood then. Her hiring wasn't a coincidence, but instead of quitting, she stayed. Not out of pride, but because she had changed. She wasn't her father's past, and she wouldn't let anyone define her by it. Instead of backing down, Ella worked even harder. If that man wanted to see her fail, he would have to watch her succeed, quietly but undeniably. Daniel, unaware that Ella had found the truth, started noticing smaller things. How she always shared her lunch with the security guards. How she helped interns format their reports. Things not listed in any contract. Things with no bonus. But things that revealed something he'd forgotten even existed. Character point one afternoon. The elevator jammed. Daniel and Ella were stuck inside for a few minutes. She breathed calmly. He muttered, impatient, "Have you always been like this? Calm in chaos?" he asked. She smiled. "No, but I learned panic doesn't open any doors." He looked at her differently then, through another lens, and couldn't reply. When the elevator resumed, the silence between them remained. But something had shifted. A crack in Daniel's armor. A thread of curiosity, or maybe respect. For the first time, he realized. Maybe he was playing the wrong game. That night, as Ella left the building, she looked back. The reflection on the glass showed her tiny silhouette against a giant tower. But inside, she knew she had never stood taller. Daniel began to realize that Ella wasn't just resilient. She was steady, subtly strong, and relentless. But that irritated him more than it impressed him. It was as if every gesture of hers challenged his deepest convictions. And he wasn't ready to be confronted by someone who didn't even raise her voice. So he intensified the game. Last-minute meetings, project changes made at the 11th hour, and vague instructions. He wanted to break her, but she just adapted. Ella felt the weight, but never showed it. When exhaustion hit, she would hide in the bathroom for 5 minutes, take a deep breath, wash her face, and return with the same calm gaze. She had learned not to take it personally, even when everything screamed that it was. "You are bigger than this," she repeated to herself like a mantra. She knew she was being tested and was beginning to understand who Daniel Hunt really was. A man hiding behind walls he had built himself. Amidst all this, a new project was launched, a social initiative between the company and local NGOs. To everyone's surprise, Daniel chose Ella to lead the coordination. No one understood why, not even her. but she accepted without question. It was a real chance to show her vision and her heart in something that mattered. He, on the other hand, just wanted to put her under maximum pressure. He expected her to crumble. But he was about to be surprised again at the first external meeting with community leaders. Ella showed both sensitivity and firmness. She listened more than she spoke, took notes, asked the right questions, and built real connections. One of the representatives later told Daniel, "Your employee has something rare. She listens with her heart." Daniel just nodded, but something inside him stirred. He, who had always spoken louder to earn respect, was now being confronted by someone who gained ground through silence. One afternoon, while reviewing a project report, he noticed a note tucked between the pages, a sketch of Ella's idea with the phrase, "What changes the world isn't power, it's presence." Daniel read it 3 times. It echoed in his mind. How could someone so simple say something so profound? For the first time, he started to wonder if his image of the Carter family was incomplete. What if he had been wrong? But as soon as the thought surfaced, he shut it down again. His pride was old. So were his wounds. He remembered his father, the bankruptcy, the headlines, the family name being tied to ruin. And the name Carter was there. That was enough, right? Except now, the name came with someone real. Ella. And that complicated everything. Because Ella, unknowingly, was reshaping his certainties just by existing the way she did. That week, Ella worked late every night. The project demanded more than hours. It demanded heart. And she gave it. On Friday, as she left the building, she found Daniel in the lobby, alone, staring out at the city. She hesitated, then approached. "Good evening, Mr. Hunt." He turned slowly and replied, with a voice softer than usual, "Good work this week, Carter." It was the first time he'd ever praised her. On the way home, Ella thought about it more than she wanted to. She knew she couldn't get carried away. She knew there was still something cold, closed off, and maybe even dangerous about Daniel. But she also sensed cracks. Something in him faltered every time she chose dignity over provocation. She didn't know what was coming, but she knew herself. She wouldn't be dragged into any game. And that was her greatest shield. Meanwhile, Daniel returned to his empty office. He turned on the lamp, glanced at the papers on the desk, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought about the way Ella looked people in the eye, unafraid. How she thanked the elevator operator. How she shared credit with coworkers who ignored her. It was all so different, so opposite from the world he had learned to survive in. On Saturday, Daniel visited his family's old house, now abandoned and falling apart. He sat on the porch and opened a box of newspaper clippings from the scandal years. One headline had the name Carter in bold. But now, staring at it, he wondered, was it fair to make Ella pay for all of it? Was she really responsible for something she barely remembered? Doubt began to ferment inside him. Ella spent the weekend caring for Lily, helping with schoolwork and cooking simple pancakes. They laughed together, as they always did when life felt lighter. But in the middle of the laughter, Ella couldn't forget Daniel's eyes in the lobby. There was something broken there. Something she recognized, because she had once been broken too. Maybe that's why, without realizing it, she didn't see him with anger. She saw him with compassion. On Monday morning, the company had a different energy. Daniel summoned Ella for a private meeting. When she entered the room, he was standing, staring out the window. Silence. Then he asked, "Do you know who I am?" Ella answered, "Yes. And I also know who I am." It threw him off. He expected denial, excuses, but not the calm with which she affirmed her identity. "Do you know what your father did to my family?" he asked. Ella took a deep breath. "I know what life did to mine, and I've spent years trying not to be defined by it." Daniel swallowed hard. There was no anger in her voice, just truth. And for the first time, he had no response. The rage that had fueled him suddenly felt weak in the face of that dignity. In the days that followed, Daniel stopped with the tests. Not because he had given up, but because he was lost, torn between the desire to punish a past that had wounded him and a growing admiration for a woman who disarmed him with grace. He began to wonder, could he start over too? But before answering that question, he hid in silence. Ella, meanwhile, immersed herself in work like never before. The social project gained traction, earned recognition, and even the most skeptical colleagues began to respect her. But inside, she carried questions without names. Why did Daniel seem to change around her? Why was there tenderness in his eyes one moment and coldness the next? It was like dealing with two men inside one body. During a feedback meeting, the department director said, "Ella, you're the heart of this team." She smiled, but inside she wondered, what if this heart was just another piece in a bigger game? The fear still visited her, but it didn't paralyze her, because her strength came from truth. And when you walk in truth, you don't have to hide. At the end of the week, Daniel called Ella into his office once more. He handed her an envelope. It was an invitation. She had been chosen to represent the company at an international event. "You deserve this," he said. She looked at him, trying to read between the lines. But all she saw was exhaustion, as if he was tired of pretending. On her way out, Ella picked up Lily at the school gate. They hugged tightly. "Are you crying, sis?" Lily asked. Ella smiled. "It's just exhaustion and maybe a little bit of gratitude." For the first time, she felt her life wasn't being pushed forward. It was being built. Daniel watched from the window. He saw Ella hugging her sister, and something inside him broke in a strange, beautiful, and terrifying way. The international event was in Boston. It was a conference on social innovation, and Ella would represent the company before leaders from around the world. For her, it was surreal. She had never left the state, let alone flown on a plane. She packed her suitcase with simple but neat clothes. She read every page of the material they'd sent, not because she wanted to impress, but because she believed in what she did, and she wanted to honor the person who had chosen her. Even if she didn't understand why, Daniel would accompany her, officially as the CEO, but deep down, he wanted to see her outside the controlled environment of the company. He still didn't know what to do with the feelings growing inside him. He just knew he needed to understand who she was, without distractions. On the flight, they sat side by side. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was loaded, as if words were either unnecessary or too dangerous to speak. On the first night of the event, Ella gave a brief speech about the company's project with the NGOs. Her words were simple, but moving. She spoke about dignity, listening, and presence. The audience applauded. Daniel, standing at the back of the room, watched her with a mix of pride and restlessness. That woman he had hired for revenge was now standing there, shining on her own merit. And he didn't know if that freed him or condemned him. After the event, they walked together through the calm city streets. Ella was enchanted by the lights, the old buildings, the bookstore that stayed open late. "I like places that seem to resist time," she said, gazing at a brick facade. Daniel replied without thinking, "Like you." It was the first time he said anything like that. She smiled but didn't answer. There was something in his eyes that made her go quiet and wait. The next morning, during a lecture, Daniel received a message. It was from his sister, Claire. The lawyer found more documents from the bankruptcy. It wasn't Carter. "Looks like Dad lied." Daniel froze. He stood up, walked into the hallway, and just stood there. Still, the world kept turning, but inside him, everything was in ruins. If Ella's father wasn't to blame, then all his rage had been a lie. He remembered his childhood, the fights at home, his father's absences, how they placed the blame on someone else instead of looking inward. It was easier to have an outside enemy. But now, the truth had come like a harsh light. And Ella didn't deserve any of what he had planned. He returned to the room and saw her smiling, talking with other company reps. And the weight of guilt collapsed on him entirely. Back at the hotel, Daniel locked himself in his room. He spent hours staring at the ceiling, replaying everything he had said, everything he had done to test her, humiliate her, push her. And she never responded with anger, always with dignity. It was as if, from the beginning, she had known more than he did. Or maybe, she had simply chosen not to return the pain. And now, he didn't know how to look her in the eye. Ella, on the other hand, didn't know what was going on. But she could feel it. Daniel missing dinner. The sudden silence. Something had shifted. The next day, she tried to break the ice over breakfast. "Are you okay?" she asked. Daniel nodded, but his eyes were far away. "Are you sure?" she insisted. He just replied, "No," and stood up. She didn't understand. But something told her this was the beginning of something deeper than she imagined. Back home, Daniel didn't go to the office. He spent the day in his apartment, going over the documents his sister had sent. Forged contracts, internal schemes, evidence that his father had used the Carter name as a scapegoat. It was official. He had been fed a lie. And now what would he do with it? Apologize? Give it all up? How do you undo a revenge that took years to build? Ella arrived at the company alone, picked up the projects, handled the pending tasks, and felt the empty space Daniel had left behind. It wasn't attachment, it was curiosity. He made her wonder, and she wasn't used to that. At home, Lily even commented, "You've been different, sis." Ella smiled without explaining, because even she didn't understand. She just knew Daniel wasn't just a difficult boss. There was something else, something broken, and she recognized at the end of the week. Daniel showed up, tired, no suit, dark circles under his eyes. He stopped at Ella's office door and asked to talk. She stood, surprised. They went to the company's terrace, where the afternoon breeze softened the heat. He took a deep breath and said, "I need to tell you something, but I don't know if you'll want to hear it." Ella replied, "If it's the truth, I'll listen." That disarmed him. He told her everything. The reason he hired her, the lie he believed, the revenge plan. Every word hit Ella like a blow, but she didn't cry. She just stayed silent. When he finished, she said, "Thank you for telling me. Truth is expensive, but lying costs more." Then she turned around and walked inside, leaving Daniel alone. For the first time, he didn't know if he deserved forgiveness. Ella didn't sleep that night. Not from pain, but from disappointment. She felt betrayed. But more than that, she felt respected. Because he had told her, without being forced, without being exposed. He told her because he chose to. And that confused her more than any lie. She had always believed in the power of truth. But now, she had to decide, what would she do with it? In the days that followed, Ella avoided Daniel. Not out of anger, but to think. She kept working, stayed strong. But now there was a wall she had built herself. And Daniel respected that. He didn't try to get closer. He just watched from afar and did something he'd never done before. He waited. He knew he couldn't force anything, that he had to let time do what rushing would ruin. On Friday, at the end of the day, Ella found an envelope on her desk. It was a letter from Daniel. Handwritten, short, honest. "Ella, I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that your truth set me free. And if one day I become someone worthy of your trust, I'll be here. D." She read it 3 times, then put it in her pocket and stared out the window for a few minutes. Thinking, Lily waited for her on the sidewalk. When she hugged her sister, she asked, "Are you sad?" Ella replied, "I'm changing." It was the only answer that made sense, because something inside her was shifting. As if, after all these years, she was learning that pain doesn't go away, but it can be transformed. Daniel, on the other side of town, walked alone to the hospital where his mother had been for months. He sat by her side, held her hand, and said, "I was wrong. About you. About Dad. About myself. And about someone who deserved better." He didn't expect a response. He just needed to say it out loud. For the first time, he was telling the truth without expecting to be understood. Just because he needed to be free of it. That on Monday, Ella returned to the company and found a different atmosphere. Co-workers who used to ignore her now greeted her. The social project had been featured in an international article. Daniel wasn't there, but the recognition was. And not because someone handed it to her, but because she planted it. She harvested it. And now, she could look at herself with pride, even without knowing what would come. She knew who she was. That night, Ella lit a lavender candle and sat with a notebook in her lap. It wasn't a diary. It was a place where she wrote to understand herself. Sometimes pain disguises itself as justice, but justice without listening is just another form of revenge. She wrote, took a deep breath, and thought of Daniel, not with anger, but with caution, with the awareness that even those who mess up might be trying to get it right in the wrong way. And that doesn't make it right, but it also doesn't make it impossible to change. Daniel, meanwhile, opened the bottom drawer of his desk and took out the only photo he had of his father. He looked at the distant gaze in the picture and said softly, "You taught me how to win, but never how to forgive." Then he put the photo away, locked the drawer, and sat there, alone, with the feeling that everything was about to begin again. But this time, he wanted to do it differently. He didn't know how. He just knew he no longer wanted to be the man who carried hatred in his pocket as if it were strength. Because now, he had met someone who was strong, without ever having to hurt anyone. Monday dawned with the scent of a new beginning. The air felt lighter, not because there were no problems, but because Ella had decided to move forward. Not to forget, but to keep going. She put on her blue blazer, tied her hair back with purpose, and walked to the company with steady steps. When she arrived, she found flowers on her desk, a small bouquet of lavender, her favorite. There was no note, but she knew. The gesture was far too discreet to come from someone who didn't understand her silences. Daniel watched from a distance, from the office with half-closed blinds. He didn't want to apply pressure, but he also couldn't hide completely anymore. The flowers weren't an apology. They were a form of listening, his way of saying, "I see you." And for the first time, he hoped that would be enough. He knew his actions couldn't be erased with gifts, but he also knew that maybe, with time, he could show who he was becoming. Ella picked up the bouquet carefully, inhaled the lavender, and smiled to herself. A small smile, but real. It wasn't forgiveness. It was presence, a quiet recognition that someone had paid attention, and more importantly, had chosen not to hide behind silence. She placed the flowers beside her computer screen and returned to her day. Focused, steady as always. But inside, something had shifted to AT lunch. They crossed paths in the break room. It was quick, a nod, but different this time. There was no tension, just a faint awkwardness. Daniel grabbed his coffee and, before leaving, said, "By the way, congratulations on the magazine article. Your idea inspired change in other companies." Ella thanked him with a look that said more than words. For the first time, they understood each other through the noise of routine. That afternoon, there was an internal presentation. Ella took the stage confidently, spoke about the impact of the project, and presented new plans for the upcoming semester. At the end, she received a standing ovation. Daniel stayed seated, but he clapped. From the heart. For the first time in a long while, he felt real pride. Not for himself, but for someone who truly deserved to be seen. After the meeting, some colleagues came to her. They congratulated her. One of them said, sincerely, "You've changed the atmosphere of this company." Ella thanked them humbly, but she knew something was changing beyond the walls. Inside herself, and maybe inside Daniel too. She wasn't ready to believe that yet, but she couldn't ignore the difference in his eyes. That night, Daniel did something unexpected. He drove to Ella's home, not to confront her, just to see. He stopped across the street and observed, saw the lights on, heard children laughing, and felt a pang in his chest. There was life there, peace, and he, despite all he had, didn't know what that felt like. For the first time, he envied the essential. Lily appeared in the window holding up a colorful poster. Daniel smiled discreetly. Then he saw Ella open the front door, step into the small garden, and water the plants. She was in an old sweatshirt, hair down, laughing at something her sister said. It was a version of her he had never seen, yet. Somehow, it felt like the truest. Daniel took a deep breath and left. It wasn't time. Not yet. The next day, he left an envelope on her desk. Inside, a note. Lunch at the Esperanza Foundation cafeteria. Today, 1 p.m. No signature. But Ella knew. She hesitated, thought about ignoring it. But something inside her said she had to go. Not to reopen wounds, but to listen. For the first time, perhaps, they would speak with their hearts open. When she arrived at the foundation, she found Daniel seated among volunteers. He wasn't in a suit, just a simple shirt, helping assemble food trays. When he saw her, he smiled gently. "Thanks for coming." Ella sat beside him, silent for a few seconds. Then, she said, "I never thought I'd see you here." He replied, "Neither did I, but you helped me see things I never saw before." And there, they began to truly talk. Daniel spoke about his mother, the bankruptcy, how he grew up angry at everyone and everything, and how he used pain as fuel to succeed. Ella listened, without interrupting. Then she shared about her father, the nights sleeping on the living room floor, dividing sacks of rice into tiny portions, and how she learned to survive without losing her kindness. Daniel looked at her as if he finally understood. At the end of lunch, a boy from the foundation walked up to them and said, "You two make a cute couple." They laughed, a little shy, but the laughter held something that wasn't just embarrassment. It was tenderness, shared for the first time. Daniel said goodbye with a handshake that lingered a second longer. Ella left with a quiet heart, but it was a peaceful kind of quiet, one that made room. In the days that followed, they began crossing paths more naturally. There was still caution, but also respect, and a new kind of affection, the kind that doesn't come from impulse, but from listening. From time, Daniel began to get more involved with the social project, not to control it, but to participate, and Ella, little by little, began looking at him without the weight. One evening, they were alone in the meeting room after everyone had left. It was raining outside. The sound of water on the windows created a bubble of calm. Daniel, gazing at the rainy city, said, "You know what scares me? Realizing that everything I've built means nothing if I lose the chance to be someone better." Ella didn't respond right away. Then she said, "Then don't lose it." That sentence stayed with him for days. It echoed, not as advice, but as a possible choice. For the first time, Daniel felt he could be more than the past. More than the hunt name. And all of that because of her. Someone he would have never met if his revenge had worked. Someone who entered his life as a target and became healing. Ella, meanwhile, remained who she always was. But inside, something was blooming. It didn't depend on Daniel, but she also couldn't deny who he was becoming. The initial hurt was still there, but something greater was growing. The certainty that some people, when they choose to change, can do so with courage. And she was willing to see how far he'd go. On Friday, at the end of the workday, Daniel waited for her at the exit. Not to talk, just to walk with her to the gate. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. But they both knew. It was a gesture. Small, but full of meaning. Because love, when it's real, doesn't begin with words. It begins with presence. Ella arrived home with a warm heart. She didn't know the name of what they were building, but she knew it was no longer destruction. And that was already the beginning of something new. Daniel, in his apartment, smiled for the first time without guilt. Not because he'd been forgiven, but because he was finally learning to become someone worthy. What had started as cautious silences had now become conversations that spoke more with glances than with words. Ella and Daniel were in no rush. Maybe because they both knew that any hurried step could collapse what they were slowly building. He showed up more often in the break room, sometimes bringing 2 coffees, leaving one by her desk without saying a word. She thanked him with a gentle smile and got back to work. But the air between them was no longer the same. On a cloudy Tuesday, Ella forgot her umbrella at the office. Daniel noticed. He grabbed his and ran to the bus stop to catch her. "I can't let you get wet." "Not today." They walked together under the same umbrella to the corner in silence. When they said goodbye, their fingers brushed by accident. Just for a second, but long enough for them both to feel something awaken in their bodies. As if that touch had broken through what had been carefully contained. That night, Ella couldn't sleep. She lay there staring at the ceiling, a strange warmth stirring in her chest. It wasn't fear, but it wasn't peace either. It was the confusion of someone who had been hurt too much to believe easily. And yet, something about Daniel was starting to feel real. She didn't know if she could trust it, but she couldn't ignore what she felt. Daniel, on his end, opened a bottle of wine, sat on his balcony, and typed on his phone, without the courage to send. "I just wanted to say the world feels simpler when you smile." He deleted it, typed it again, deleted it again. In the end, he put the phone aside and stared at the city lights. For the first time, he wanted something he didn't know how to control, and that scared him more than any contract. In the days that followed, they worked together on expanding the social project. They visited communities, listened to stories, shared silences. One time, during a visit to a women's shelter, Ella held a young woman's hand and said, "You are not what they did to you." Daniel stepped aside discreetly and wiped his eyes. That sentence pierced through his own story, because maybe that was what he had needed to hear years ago. One Friday night, Ella and Daniel were alone at the foundation, organizing donation boxes. They laughed over silly things, shared longer glances. At one point, she lost her balance trying to reach a box on a high shelf. He caught her by the waist. They froze, too close, but neither pulled away, until Ella gently stepped back. "Good night, Daniel." He replied only, "Good night, Ella." But his tone said everything. On Saturday, Ella received flowers at home. A small note came with them, not to impress you, just to remind you that someone is thinking of you, with respect. She read it 3 times. She didn't know whether to smile or cry. She had received gifts before, but none that meant this much. Daniel wasn't trying to win her over with grand gestures. He was trying to learn how to love the right way, but her heart still carried scars. and a part of her whispered, "Be careful," because she knew what it was like to cling to someone who seemed safe until they weren't. On Monday, she kept a little distance. Daniel noticed, but didn't force anything. He simply watched and understood, because he too knew the weight of distrust. And he didn't want to invade the space she had fought so hard to protect. During an important meeting, Ella presented a bold proposal to integrate emotional education into the Foundation's programs. Daniel listened silently. When she finished, everyone applauded. He stepped closer and said, with tears in his eyes, "You make the world feel possible." She smiled, a smile that said, "Thank you, but go slow." And he understood. Sometimes, love needs breaks before it can grow wings. That night, Ella talked with Lily about feelings. Her sister, with the wisdom of someone who sees what adults overcomplicate, asked, "Do you like him?" Ella hesitated. "I do, but I'm scared." Lily hugged her and said, "Then wait. But don't run." Ella smiled, her eyes moist. Maybe love was just that, waiting without running, staying without losing yourself. Daniel, meanwhile, started writing again. Not letters, not texts, but thoughts, reflections, things he'd never had the courage to say aloud. He kept everything in a notebook, and with each page, he discovered more of his humanity. Less CEO, more man. A man who didn't want to win anymore, but to belong. And that began with listening. On a sunny Sunday, they ran into each other by chance at the market. Daniel was holding a bag of bread. Ella, with Lily. The three of them stood there, laughing at the coincidence. They walked together to the park, sat on a bench. Lily ran off to the playground, and they watched her. "She's amazing," Daniel said. "She's my root," Ella replied. He looked at her and thought, maybe I want to be soil too. The following days were filled with work, but there was always a moment. A coffee left on her desk, a shared glance in a meeting, a brush of shoulders in the hallway, when their hearts beat faster. Nothing was said, but everything was felt, and they both knew they were falling. Not quickly, but deeply. Until, one rainy night, Daniel went to the old apartment where he used to live with his family. He walked in, sat on the floor of the empty living room, and called Ella. "I need to show you something." She hesitated, but went. When she arrived, she found him there, wet, vulnerable, eyes lowered. This is where everything fell apart. "And now, I want to start again, not with a plea, but with truth." She sat beside him, and they stayed in silence. Together, she rested her head on his shoulder. And he didn't move, didn't try to turn it into anything more, didn't rush. He simply stayed with her. Because for the first time, Daniel understood that love doesn't begin with conquest, but with surrender. And Ella, with her presence, gave him more than any woman ever had: trust. The next morning, at the company, everyone was talking about the Foundation's success. A newspaper had published a story about the project's social transformation. And there was a photo, Ella and Daniel side by side, smiling without masks. It was the first time they saw themselves like that, beyond pain, beyond revenge, just present. But every beginning demands decisions. And now, they both knew they could no longer hide behind just professional or just the past. They stood before something real, and the choice to stay together or walk away couldn't be postponed any longer. In the final scene of that chapter, Ella closed the meeting room door. Daniel was inside. They locked eyes, and for the first time, with no shield or shadow, he asked, "Ella, if I asked you to stay, despite everything, would you?" She didn't answer right away, but her eyes said yes. Ella walked out with her heart ablaze, not from doubt, but from intensity. Daniel was no longer the man who had hired her for revenge. He was now the man who chose to listen, who waited, who allowed himself to feel. And that moved her, more than any word. She walked to the break room, poured herself a hot tea, and took a deep breath. She didn't know what they were living, but she knew that if it continued, it wouldn't be shallow. It would be true, the kind that changes destinies. Daniel sat alone in the room, staring at the door that had just closed seconds earlier. He was never good at waiting. He had always learned to take, to push, to control. But now, with Ella, everything was different. He wanted to be worthy, not accidentally desired. And that made him stronger and more vulnerable too. He returned to his desk and opened the notebook he had been writing in. He wrote just one sentence: "To love is to stop winning and start staying." And he knew then His life would never be the same. What seemed solid began to crack, subtly. All it took was one phone call. A former partner at Hunt Corporation, who had been gone for years, contacted the board claiming he had compromising documents about the Carter family's past, and that Ella had withheld them. No one knew if it was true, but the news spread fast. And within days, the looks at the office grew heavy again. Once more, Ella felt the ground vanish beneath her. Daniel was the first to receive the report. He read it with trembling hands. He knew it could be a setup, but Ella's name was there. And though reason begged for caution, his heart ached at the thought of being deceived again. For hours, he didn't know what to think, torn between the man who always distrusted and the man who was learning to believe. Ella was summoned to a board meeting. Daniel wasn't there, and that hurt more than the accusation itself. She sat down, eyes steady, voice composed, and said, "I have nothing to hide. You can investigate everything, but I won't accept being judged because of a last name." Even so, when she left the room, she felt the weight of suspicion clinging to her skin like dust from a past that never let go. That afternoon, she went to find Daniel. She needed to hear it from him, to understand what was happening. He received her, but something in his eyes had changed. "Did you know about these documents?" he asked. Ella paused for a second, then answered, "I knew my father had made some deals, but I never saw anything that would implicate him this way. If I had, I would have told you." Daniel lowered his gaze. "I wanted to believe." Those words tore her apart inside. "So you don't believe me?" she asked, her voice cracking for the first time. He didn't answer. The silence was louder than any shout. Ella stood up, eyes brimming but no tears falling. "You know what hurts, Daniel? It's not being accused. I'm used to that. It's realizing that even after everything, you still see me as my father." And she walked out, leaving behind a room colder than it had ever been. In the days that followed, Ella pulled away. She requested a short leave for personal reasons. She spent her time taking care of Lily, walking in the park, trying to understand why pain always returned right when love seemed possible. Daniel tried to write, to call, but couldn't. He was stuck between the fear of being deceived and the guilt of not having truly listened. It was Daniel's sister, Claire, who found the truth. She investigated the documents and discovered they were fake, forged by a former employee who wanted to destroy Ella out of personal revenge. When Daniel read the evidence, the world spun. She had told the truth, and once again, he had chosen to doubt her. And now, it might be too late. That night, he went to Ella's house. Lily answered, "My sister doesn't want to see anyone." Daniel knelt down to her height and said, "Tell her I didn't come to explain. I came to ask for forgiveness." Lily went inside. Minutes later, Ella appeared at the door, hair tied back, tired eyes, but as strong as ever. "You don't know what it's like to have your truth questioned, Daniel." He replied, "No, but I know now how much it hurts to doubt someone who speaks from the heart." "And what do you want now?" she asked, arms crossed. "To say that I'm willing to relearn, to truly listen, to see you without the ghosts my father left behind." Ella took a deep breath. "I'm not even half of what they think I am, but I'm whole in what I feel. And it hurt to see that you didn't see that." He nodded. "I want to see it, but I need you to let me try." She didn't answer, but she didn't close the door either. And that was a beginning. The next day, Ella returned to the company, head held high. Those who used to whisper now stood silent before her strength. Daniel saw her in the hallway and simply said, "Thank you for coming back." She replied, "I didn't come back for you. I came back for me. But maybe one day, I'll come back for us." He smiled, a small smile, but full of hope. And he knew he'd have to earn every step, slowly, without promises. In the foundation's office, while organizing reports, Ella found Daniel's notebook left open on the table. On the page it read, "The most painful lie is the one we tell ourselves when we choose to doubt someone we love." She closed the notebook slowly, like someone honoring another's process. And for the first time since the distance, she felt maybe there was still a path. Daniel began showing up more at the foundation, not as a CEO, but as a volunteer. He helped with kids, packed donations, listened to stories. Ella watched him from afar, and little by little, she saw that hardened man softening into humanity. One day, seeing him on his knees cleaning the floor alongside a 5-year-old boy, she smiled, not because of what he was doing, but because of who he was becoming. That Friday, there was a thank you event for volunteers. Ella was called on stage. At the end of her speech, she thanked everyone, and then looked at Daniel. And thank you to those who have the courage to change. Everyone applauded, but he knew those words were meant for him, and he felt his heart squeeze with the hope of a new beginning. Later that evening, Daniel approached Ella in the garden. They were alone. He handed her a small flower picked right there. You said you didn't come back for me. I understood, but I'm here if one day you want someone walking beside you. Ella took the flower. Gently. I'm not ready, but I didn't leave. And he smiled, because now he understood. The love that stays is the one that honors the other's timing. In the days that followed, there were no declarations, but there was consistency. He was there, always. No promises, no pressure, just present. And Ella, slowly, began to allow herself to believe again. Not because of words, but because of daily actions proving that real love doesn't push. It stays. Lily started smiling more. The house felt lighter. Ella wrote more in her notebook. Sometimes, love hurts before it heals. But when it heals, it transforms. Daniel, in turn, stared out the office window and finally understood. His greatest achievement wasn't leading companies. It was relearning how to love. And that Saturday afternoon, as the sunlight filtered through the foundation's windows and the two of them sorted winter donations together, their arms brushed. Lightly. She didn't pull away. Neither did he. They stayed like that, in silence. But it wasn't an ending silence. It was the quiet of those who had finally found a safe place in the midst of the chaos. That night, as Ella closed the foundation's door, she looked back and saw Daniel still inside, storing toys in boxes. She said nothing, just watched. And for the first time, she felt peace seeing him there. Not as a CEO, not as a figure of power, but as someone trying to belong. She knew it wasn't time yet to give her heart, but she also knew she no longer needed to guard it behind high walls. Daniel came out minutes later and found her waiting at the gate. They walked side by side down the sidewalk, not touching, but close in a way that said everything. Do you know what you've taught me, Ella? He said. That sometimes forgiveness doesn't come with words. It comes with presence. She didn't reply, but nodded slowly. And that was enough. It was as if they were finally saying the same thing, in the right time, in the language of silence. When they parted, Ella entered her house, hugged Lily tightly, and whispered, I think I'm learning to stay, even while afraid. And outside, Daniel leaned on the gate for a few seconds before walking away. Because now, more than any victory, all he wanted was to be worthy of staying where he once tried only to control. And that desire was already love in a state of rebuilding. When love matures, it stops shouting. It learns to whisper in the details. In the coffee left on the table. In the umbrella quietly shared. In the stay a little longer, spoken only with the eyes. And that's exactly where Ella and Daniel were now. They couldn't name what they felt, but they knew it was real. And that it deserved to be lived slowly, with respect, with care. For the first time, there was no rush. There was presence. Daniel began going to the foundation even. On days he wasn't needed. He arrived early, helped set up workshop rooms, picked up donations with volunteers. It was as if, in that simple space, he could finally breathe. Ella watched from afar, letting time do what no words could. Little by little, her walls came down. Not because he asked, but because he stayed. One Saturday afternoon, they organized a charity bazaar together. Ella handled every detail with the skill of someone who knew how to do a lot with very little. Daniel simply followed, learning how to serve without needing to lead. During a break, they sat together under a makeshift tent. A light rain fell. He offered her a piece of bread. She accepted, and in that simple gesture, there was more intimacy than in 1,000 empty promises. Lily ran through the fair with other children, laughing loudly. She was the joy Ella had always tried to protect. Daniel looked at her and said, She's beautiful and free. Ella nodded. I've always wanted to give her a world where no one makes her feel small. Daniel held that silence gently, as if it were too fragile to break. Because, in some way, she was also talking about herself. And he felt the responsibility to never dim that light. By the end of the event, everyone was exhausted. Ella and Daniel stayed behind, collecting boxes. As he stored the last one, he looked at her and said, Can I take you home? Ella paused for a few seconds, then replied, You can. but no rush. And they walked together to the car, slow steps and attentive hearts. Because, in that moment, every second mattered more than the destination. That night, they talked more than ever about childhood, fears, longings. Daniel spoke about his mother, about the guilt he carried. Ella spoke about sleepless nights and moments when she nearly gave up. It felt like by telling each other where it hurt, they were healing old wounds together. And when silence came, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was shelter, as if saying, "I'm here," no longer needed sound that I in the days that followed. Nothing changed on the outside. They kept working together, managing projects, keeping a certain discretion. But something had shifted inside. Their eyes said more. Their gestures were gentler. And suddenly, the world felt a little less harsh. Because now there was one certainty. They were choosing each other. Not out of loneliness, but with conviction. One day, Daniel showed up late to a meeting. He brought a simple cake from the neighborhood bakery. "Sorry I'm late. I brought peace in sugar form." Ella laughed. Everyone laughed. But deep down, she knew. He was trying to create different memories. Small ones, real ones. And that touched her more than any expensive gift she had ever received. A tea home. Lily started asking more about Daniel. "Is he your boyfriend?" Ella smiled. "He's someone who stays, even when it would be easier to leave." Lily replied, "Then he's rare." Ella nodded silently. Because after so many people who left, it was new and beautiful to have someone who stayed. Quietly, gently, simply, there. Daniel, in turn, no longer hid behind titles. He began walking around the company with a different gaze. He talked more with employees, listened more than he spoke. Ella watched him from afar and saw a new man emerging. Not the CEO who once hired her for revenge, but the man who now chose to be better every single day. And that made her fall for him. In silence. One Sunday afternoon, they went to a used book fair. Daniel picked an old poetry book and gave it to her. There's a page marked. Ella opened it and found the verse, "Love doesn't need to conquer. It needs to remain." She closed the book slowly, eyes wet. And for the first time, she held his hand, not on impulse, but by choice. News of the foundation's success spread through the city. New partnerships were formed. Ella was invited to speak at a national event. Daniel went with her, this time as silent support. He sat among the audience, proud. When she finished, everyone gave her a standing ovation. He stayed seated, just looking at her, as if looking at home. On the way back, the car was quiet, until he said, "You're building something incredible." Ella replied, "We are." And in that "we," there was everything. Because even with different pasts, distinct wounds, and broken pieces, they were slowly becoming one. Not by fusion, but through presence. At the end of that week, Lily asked if they could have dinner together. All three of us. They had pizza, watched a movie, laughed like a small, improvised family. And Daniel, seeing Ella asleep on the couch with her head resting on his shoulder, felt something he'd never felt before, belonging. Not to a place, but to people. The next day, at the office, he found an envelope on his desk. Inside was a handwritten note from Ella. "What saves us is never what shouts. It's what stays." Daniel kept the note in his wallet. He knew those words would anchor him when fear tried to creep back in. Ella was changing too. She didn't guard herself so tightly anymore. She allowed herself to laugh louder, to accept help, to make plans. And above all, she believed she could be loved without having to prove her worth. Because now she saw, the right kind of love doesn't demand effort to exist. It only needs to be true. One evening, Daniel took her to the top of an old building. Downtown. There, under the city lights and the distant hum of traffic, he said, "I took too long to understand. But now I know. I don't want to win you, Ella. I just want to walk beside you." She took his hand. "Then walk at my pace, and I'll take you wherever we need to go." That night, there was no kiss. But there was something greater. A silent commitment between two hearts that had faced it all and still chose to walk forward. Not on impulse, but out of permanence. And in the real world, that's the kind of love that survives. In the days that followed, Daniel began to realize that loving Ella wasn't about grand promises, but about showing up in the everyday. Sitting beside her while she reviewed reports, helping Lily with homework, even when he didn't understand math, washing dishes after dinner, in silence. And each ordinary gesture was For him, more transformative than any romantic speech. Because now he knew, love proves itself through the simple things. Ella, for her part, had changed too. Lighter, more open, but just as strong. She hadn't bent herself to fit Daniel. He had learned to walk at her pace. And that made all the difference. With him, she didn't have to explain who she was. She didn't have to hide her scars. For the first time, she was in a relationship where she wasn't questioned. She was embraced. And that healed more than any pretty words ever could. One calm afternoon, sitting together on the foundation's porch, Ella said, "We don't choose where we break, but we can choose where to rebuild." Daniel held her hand tightly and replied, "I want to rebuild wherever you are." And in that moment, without ceremony, without script, they both knew they were ready. Not for a fairy tale ending, but for a real beginning, built on presence, listening, and the daily choice to stay. Time went by, and with it came the certainty. What Ella and Daniel were building wasn't fragile. It was strong, like roots that grow in silence. It wasn't the kind of love that starts with fireworks, but the kind that stays through cloudy days. The foundation kept growing, new volunteers arrived, and the company adopted a new culture, more human, more connected. Ella had become a reference. Daniel, now, was a leader who had learned how to listen. One sunny morning, Daniel invited Ella for a walk down the same street where it all began. She smiled when she recognized the Hunt Corporation building. "This is where you hired me just to bring me down." He chuckled with a calm gaze. "And this is where you taught me how to become someone better." Ella looked at him without bitterness, just with memory. "Then we're even." Daniel shook his head. "No, I still owe you a lifetime of listening." That afternoon, they prepared an event together for the new youth group at the foundation. Daniel brought Lily along to help with the books, and the three of them organized everything with care and simplicity. At the end, they sat under a tree, barefoot on the grass, hearts light. Ella watched as Lily rested in Daniel's lap, as if he had always belonged in their little world. And right there, without needing to say a word, she knew he stayed. Truly. At home, Ella wrote another page in her journal. He didn't force his way in, didn't try to shape the ending. He simply arrived, sat beside me, and listened. And he stayed. She closed the notebook softly. For the first time, there was no uncertainty in her words. Not because everything was perfect, but because now she knew real love is the one that stays after the illusions fade. The following week, Daniel organized a surprise dinner at the foundation. He gathered friends, volunteers, and people who had been part of their journey. When Ella arrived, she found the space decorated with simplicity and care. Black and white photos hung on the walls, handwritten quotes, and in the center of the room, a table with dried flowers and a small sign. "To the one who taught me that the strongest love is the one that stays." During dinner, Daniel asked to speak. He held the microphone with trembling hands, looked at Ella, and said, "I hired you out of anger. Then I watched you out of pride. But I fell in love in silence with how you transform everything around you. And today, I just want to know if I can keep standing beside you. Not as a boss, not as a broken man, but as someone who finally learned that to love is to listen." The room went still. Ella stood up, walked to him, and simply said, "Stay." The kiss that followed was quiet. No rush, no stage. Even with people watching, it felt like the world had faded, leaving only two hearts that chose each other, without rushing, without drama, even when giving up would have been easier. After the event, they sat alone in the garden of the foundation. Daniel held her hand and asked, "Do you forgive me for everything?" Ella smiled softly. "I haven't forgotten, but I chose to move forward. And you've walked beside me without asking for anything. That's more than forgiveness. That's rebuilding." He nodded and knew that was the most beautiful answer he could ever receive. In the months that followed, they stayed together, working, laughing, messing up, starting over. Nothing was perfect, but it was real. Lily grew up feeling safe, knowing her mother was a harbor, and that Daniel was now part of that too. They learned how to share silence, how to respect the hard days, how to celebrate small victories, like finishing painting a room at the foundation, or finally learning how to bake bread without burning it. One day, in a meeting with investors, Daniel presented the company's new policy. "We're a corporation, yes, but we choose to be a community. Because the only prophet that matters is the one that leaves a mark on people. When he finished, he looked over at Ella sitting among the directors. And he knew. Those words were born from her, by the end of. That year, they launched a new scholarship program named after Robert Carter. Ella insisted on the name. I don't erase what was. I transform it. Daniel cried when he saw the name displayed with honor. She didn't want justice through pain. She wanted healing through legacy. And in that moment, he understood. Only someone truly strong is capable of loving even the past. One rainy afternoon, they sat on the porch of the house they now shared. Blankets over their legs, teacups in their hands. Lily played with the dog in the yard. Daniel looked at Ella and said, "If you'd told me in the beginning that all this would come after, I wouldn't have believed it." Ella laughed. Neither would I. And yet, there they were. With everything they had lived. With everything they had chosen to build. Ella kept writing. Now, with more lightness. A new notebook. New pages. On one, she wrote, "We don't save anyone. But when we choose to love with presence and listening, we help them save themselves." She closed the journal and placed it on the shelf. Beside it, a photo of the three of them, smiling on the steps of the foundation. A family, no caption needed. Daniel learned to cook. Terribly, but with dedication. He made Ella coffee on Sundays while she read in silence. And it was in this kind of routine that they found the truest love. The one that doesn't make noise. That doesn't need witnesses. That doesn't make headlines, but becomes home. In the final scene, they are together at a foundation event. Ella gives a speech, her eyes bright with passion. Daniel watches from the crowd, with that same look of admiration. When she finishes, he walks over, gently hugs her, and says, "I still haven't learned everything, but I've learned how to stay." She smiles. "And I've learned that love is also about allowing yourself to be loved." The audience applauds, but they only see each other. There, in the middle of the crowd, they are no longer two broken stories trying to fit. They are two whole truths, choosing to rebuild side by side. And that is the kind of love nothing can ever destroy. If this story touched your heart, like this video so more people can discover the power of love built on presence, listening, and staying. Share it with someone you would choose to stay with. Comment below. Do you believe that the truest love is the one that chooses to stay even when leaving would be easier? And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that heal, inspire, and remind us that real love still exists. Here, stories don't end. They continue within those who feel them.